There are things that some people carry that the world never sees. Not because the world wouldn't understand, but because the person carrying them has decided that the carrying is its own business, private, sufficient, requiring no witness. Louis Armstrong carried one of these things for 46 years, through every concert hall and recording studio and television stage that his career placed him in, and almost nobody knew. His name was Clarence Hatfield Armstrong. He had come into Louis Armstrong's life in 1915, when Armstrong was 14 years old and Clarence was 3, a small child with a specific kind of damage already done to him. Clarence was the son of Armstrong's cousin, Flora, who had died not long after his birth, leaving the infant in circumstances that required someone to step forward. Armstrong's family stepped forward, and when Armstrong himself was old enough to have a home of his own, Clarence came with that home as a permanent fact, not a guest, not a case to be managed, not an arrangement to be reconsidered when circumstances changed. A member of the household, a son. The damage that Clarence had sustained came from a fall in infancy. He had been dropped, and the fall had produced brain damage severe enough to affect his development permanently. He could not live on his own. He could not manage the ordinary requirements of adult independence. He needed, on a continuing basis, the kind of care and supervision that placed him in a category the era had a clear and standard answer for: institutions. State facilities that housed people whose needs exceeded what domestic life could easily provide. This was the common arrangement, the practical one, the one that was neither cruel nor unusual by the standards of the time, and that many families in similar situations chose when it was available to them. Armstrong chose something else. What he chose was to bring Clarence into his life and keep him there. Through the Chicago years, when he was recording the Hot 5 sessions and becoming the most significant jazz musician of his generation, through the years of big band touring and the gradual construction of an international reputation that made his face and his trumpet among the most recognizable combinations of person and instrument in American popular culture. Through the move to New York, the films, the radio appearances, the television performances, the exhausting and relentless schedule of a career that demanded everything a human body and mind could give, and then asked for more. Clarence was there. He was at the house in Corona, Queens, which Armstrong and his wife Lucille purchased in 1943, a modest, comfortable house in a working-class neighborhood that Armstrong would live in for the rest of his life, despite the fact that his income, by the 1940s and 1950s, was more than sufficient to have placed him somewhere that matched the scale of his fame. He chose Corona. He chose the house. And in the house, Clarence was part of what the house was. Not as a hidden thing, not as a secret requiring careful management, as a member of the family, which is what he was. The people who worked with Armstrong professionally, the musicians in his band, the recording engineers, the producers, the managers who organized the touring schedules and contract negotiations, were often entirely unaware that Clarence existed. Armstrong did not speak about him in the contexts where he might have. He did not include him in the stories he told about his life, which were many and warmly rendered. He did not reference him in interviews. The name did not appear in profiles. The relationship did not enter the public record in any form that those who followed Armstrong's career from the outside would have encountered. The specific quality of Armstrong's commitment to Clarence, its duration, its quietness, the complete absence of the performative dimension that characterizes so much public charitable behavior, was something that those who knew about it consistently noted as one of the most revealing things about him. There is a particular kind of virtue that requires an audience, that is, organized, whether consciously or not, around the awareness of being seen performing it. The good done is real, even when the doing of it is partly shaped by the knowledge of being observed. But it is a different thing from the virtue that happens entirely in private, that has no external witness, that accumulates not in the record of public acts, but in the texture of daily life, in the small, continuous choices of someone who has decided that a specific responsibility is theirs, and who meets it without expecting acknowledgement. Armstrong's relationship with Clarence was the second kind. Nobody was watching. Nobody was writing it down. Nobody was going to report it. The decades of concerts and recordings that made Armstrong famous produced, simultaneously, a private life that contained this person, this son, this man who needed ongoing care. And that private life went entirely unwitnessed by the public world that thought it knew him. The world that thought it knew Louis Armstrong knew the smile, the trumpet, the voice, the warmth, the particular quality of joyful generosity he directed outward at whatever audience was in front of him. This was real. And the man who had this quality in public had, at the same time, a domestic life that the public didn't see. And in that domestic life was Clarence. The warmth Armstrong directed toward Clarence was the same warmth, not a different thing, not a contradiction, but the same quality of the same man, operating in a private register where there was no audience to receive it and no record being kept. When Armstrong returned home from a tour, from weeks or months of concerts that had required everything he had, that had placed him before audiences across America and Europe, and eventually across much of the world, he came back to the house in Queens. He came back to Lucille. He came back to the rooms he had lived in, the kitchen, the den, the bedroom, the tape recorder in the den where he recorded himself talking and playing for his own pleasure. And he came back to Clarence. The transition from public to private, from the world of concerts and applause and the particular exhaustion of being Louis Armstrong before an audience, to the ordinary domesticity of the house in Corona, was a transition those who observed him described as something he made without particular difficulty. He had been doing it long enough that the two worlds had their own established relationship to each other. The public world was large and loud and full of people. The private one was small and quiet and contained the people who were actually his. Clarence was one of those people. Had been one of them since 1915, would be one of them until the end. Armstrong kept this to himself, not from shame, not from complexity, because it was private, and he understood that private things were entitled to remain private, because the virtue of it was not located in the being known of it. Because 46 years of showing up for someone is its own sufficient fact, requiring no witness to be real. The silence was not the silence of concealment in the way that concealment usually operates. It was not organized around shame or around complexity or around a wish that things were different. It was the silence of a man who had decided that certain things belonged to him and not to the world, and who maintained that boundary with the same discipline that he brought to everything he regarded as genuinely his own. Armstrong had, in his public life, an extraordinary capacity for openness. He talked warmly and at length about music, about New Orleans, about the performances he had given and the people he had known. He was generous with his time and his attention in the way that very few people at his level of fame managed to sustain across a career as long as his. The warmth was real. The people who received it understood that what they were receiving was not a performance. It was him. And yet there was a part of him that was not available, and that part included Clarence. Those who did know about Clarence, the small circle of people who had genuine access to the domestic life of the house in Corona, described the household arrangement with a consistency that suggests something uncomplicated. Clarence was there, he was cared for, he was part of what the house was, and Armstrong moved through the house with him the way a person moves through their home with the people who belong there. Not with the careful attentiveness of someone performing a duty, with the ordinary ease of someone who has been doing this long enough that it has stopped requiring any particular awareness and has simply become the texture of daily life. Clarence called Armstrong his father. This was the word he used and the relationship he understood, and those who knew them both did not describe it as an inaccuracy. Whatever the exact biological and legal architecture of the relationship, what it was in practice was a father and a son. The older man responsible for the younger man understanding the older as the person on whom his life depended. The relationship having accumulated across decades the weight and the familiarity of something that had simply always been true. What Clarence's life looked like from the inside, what he understood about the world, what he knew or didn't know of Armstrong's public significance, what he made of the concerts and the recordings and the photographs, and the gradual accumulation of a fame that made his father's face recognizable to people across 5 continents, is something that those who knew him describe with the appropriate uncertainty. Clarence's relationship to the world was not organized around the categories the question assumes. He understood what he understood. He knew his father. He was at home. Lucille Armstrong, who married Armstrong in 1942 and who managed the household with the skill and warmth of someone who fully understood what she was taking on, had incorporated Clarence into the rhythms of the house as though there had never been a time when he was not there. She cooked for him. She made sure his needs were met. She treated him, in the day-to-day of domestic life, as hers to look after, as part of what the house was. The two of them, Armstrong and Lucille, had no biological children together. The family that he and Lucille built in the house in Queens was the family of 2 people who had chosen each other, and who had, as part of that choice, chosen Clarence. It was not complicated. It was simply what it was, for 30 years of marriage, until Armstrong died. The household was theirs. Clarence was theirs. The commitment was made, and it was kept. When Louis Armstrong died on the morning of July 6, 1971, in the house in Queens where he had lived for nearly 30 years, Clarence was 59 years old. He had known Armstrong as his father for his entire life, which means that the loss he experienced on that morning was the loss of the most fundamental person in his world. The person around whom the shape of his life had been organized since before he was old enough to understand what organization meant. What that loss looked like from the inside, what Clarence understood about what had happened, what categories were available to him for processing an event of that magnitude, is something that those who knew him describe with the care of people who understand that the question is not fully answerable. What is known is that Clarence was present. He was there for the rituals that the world performed around Armstrong's death, and he occupied in those rituals an unusual position. A son who was not publicly known as a son, grieving in the open for a man whose public grief was being expressed by the whole of the jazz world and well beyond it. Lucille Armstrong survived her husband by 17 years. She continued to care for Clarence after Armstrong's death, maintaining the arrangement that Armstrong had established and that she had been part of for decades. This continuation, This extending of the commitment beyond the man who had originated it was its own statement about the nature of what had been built in the house in Queens. The commitment had become the household's commitment. It was not personal to Armstrong alone. Lucille honored it until she was no longer able to. The house became, after Lucille's death in 1983, the Louis Armstrong House Museum, preserved largely as it had been during the years when Armstrong and Lucille lived there, its rooms maintained with the objects and arrangements of the life that had been lived in them. It is, in its way, the most honest portrait of Armstrong that exists. More honest than any biography, more specific than any recording, because it shows the scale of the life he actually lived, not large and heroic, but small and domestic, specifically located in a working-class neighborhood in Queens, containing exactly the things and the people that he had decided were his. Clarence's presence in the house was part of the history of the house. It is part of the record now. And what that presence reveals about Louis Armstrong, about the relationship between the warmth he expressed publicly and the warmth that grounded and sustained him in private, is something that those who have written most carefully about his life return to with attention. The public warmth was real. The private warmth was real. They were not different things. They were the same quality of the same person, operating at different scales, in different registers, and in the case of the private warmth, in front of no audience at all. The world knew Louis Armstrong for 50 years. It knew his trumpet and his voice and his smile and the particular quality of generosity he brought to every stage he ever stood on. It did not know, for almost the entire length of those 50 years, that the same man who brought all of that warmth to the stage came home after the concerts to a house where someone was waiting for him. Someone who called him his father. Someone whose life he had been responsible for since 1915, since he himself was 14 years old. Armstrong did not need the world to know this in order for it to be true. He did not perform it. He did not announce it. He simply did it for 46 years, in private, without witness, through every phase of one of the most public careers in the history of American music. He never told anyone. He simply did it. For 46 years, in private, without witness. Which is, in the end, the truest thing about him that can be said. The music was what the world heard. This was what he was.